Italy did not collapse in fire. It emptied. The roads still connected the peninsula. The cities still carried Roman names. Laws were still written in Latin. Coins still bore imperial faces, and bishops still spoke of order. But the power that once made those things matter was gone. What remained was geography without authority. By the middle of the 6th century, Italy was no longer the heart of an empire. It was a battlefield that had forgotten who it belonged to. Decades of war between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Ostrogoths had devastated the land. Fields were abandoned. Cities were depopulated. Armies marched back and forth, winning battles that no longer produced stability. Then came plague. The peninsula survived, but barely. Officially, Italy belonged to the Roman Empire. In reality, imperial control was thin, uneven, and defensive. The Byzantines held Ravenna. They controlled fragments of the coastline. Rome itself remained symbolically powerful, but militarily exposed. Between these islands of authority stretched vast interior regions where no one could reliably enforce law, taxation, or defense. Italy had become a vacuum, and vacuums attract movement. To the north, the Alpine passes, once guarded by Roman fortresses, stood open. Beyond them lived a people not yet shaped by Italy, a people still moving. They called themselves the Langobards, the Lombards, a Germanic people whose name, according to their own legends, came from their long beards, worn as a mark of identity and war. They were not newcomers to migration. For generations, the Lombards had moved steadily southward, learning how to fight, how to survive, and how to seize opportunity when it appeared. Italy was that opportunity. In 568 CE, the Lombards crossed into Italy, not as a raiding party, not as a single army, but as a people in motion. Warriors marched alongside their families. Children, elders, livestock, and wagons followed the columns. This was not a campaign meant to end. It was a relocation. They were not here to extract wealth and leave. They were here to stay. At their head was King Alban, a ruler forged by war, shaped by violence, and ambitious enough to gamble everything on Italy's weakness. Alban understood something Rome's enemies had learned again and again. Italy did not need to be conquered all at once. It only needed to be entered. The Lombards encountered little organized resistance. Northern Italy was exhausted. Cities opened their gates not always in fear but in calculation. Imperial garrisons were underpaid, undermanned, and uncertain of support. Sometimes conquest came by force. Often it came by silence. What emerged was not a unified state. It was a mosaic. Lombard-controlled land sat beside Roman cities, Byzantine corridors, papal estates, and autonomous towns. Power was local. Loyalty was personal. Authority was negotiated. Italy did not become Lombard overnight. It became divided. The Lombards are often remembered as barbarians, and at first that description was accurate. They came from a world of tribal loyalty, warrior kingship, and customary law. Their religion was alien to Roman Italy. Their customs clashed with centuries of imperial tradition. But conquest does not freeze a people in time. It changes them. Over the decades, the Lombards adapted. They adopted Latin as a language of rule. They issued written law codes. They converted slowly and unevenly to Christianity. They learned how to rule cities they had never built. They stopped being migrants. They became kings. The Lombard kingdom would last for more than 2 centuries, longer than many of the Germanic states that rose from Rome's ruins. It endured because it did not replace Rome. It settled into its remains, but Italy was never unified. Lombard dukes ruled semi-independently. The papacy grew more assertive. Byzantine power lingered in the south. Every border was a fault line. And beyond the Alps, a new force was rising, a Frankish king, crowned by the church. Armed not just with armies but legitimacy, his name would end the Lombard kingdom. Charlemagne. This is not the story of Rome's fall. It is the story of what came after, a kingdom born from migration, shaped by fragmentation, and erased by empire. This is the story of the Lombards, the barbarian kings of Italy. Legendary origins. The Lombards did not begin as conquerors of Italy. They began as a people who believed they came from the edge of the world, According to their own origin legend, recorded centuries later in the Origo Gentes Langobardorum, the Langobards emerged from an island called Skadanen, most often identified with Scandinavia. Whether this was literal geography or symbolic memory, the story mattered. It framed the Lombards as a people shaped by departure, movement, and divine favor. From the very beginning, their identity was tied to migration, southward drift. This movement was not a single journey. It unfolded over generations. The Langobards migrated gradually southward, settling, moving again, and adapting as they went. By the time they entered the written record of the Roman world, they were already far from their legendary homeland. What mattered was not where they started, but that they never stayed still. The Lower Elbe. By the 1st century CE, Roman observers had taken notice. Writers like Tacitus described the Langobards as a small but formidable people living near the Lower Elbe River. They were not numerous, but they were dangerous, known for their fierce independence and willingness to fight stronger neighbors rather than submit. At this stage, the Lombards were not a kingdom. They were a confederation of warrior clans, a tribal society. Lombard society revolved around kinship and loyalty. Power rested not in institutions, but in leaders who could command respect in war. Authority was personal, earned, and fragile. Customary law governed disputes, enforced by tradition rather than bureaucracy. Their religion mirrored that of other Germanic peoples, a pantheon of gods associated with war, fate, and divine favor, closely resembling what we now recognize from Norse mythology. This was a world where identity was proven through action. Into the Roman shad. As centuries passed, the Lombards moved again, this time into the orbit of Rome. By the 5th century CE, they had entered Pannonia, a frontier region spanning parts of modern Western Hungary and Eastern Austria. Here, the Roman world was collapsing but not yet gone. This borderland became a classroom. Pannonia, a turning point. In Pannonia, the Lombards encountered other migrating peoples, the Heruli, the Gepids, the Ostrogoths. They fought some. They allied with others. They learned from all of them. Most importantly, they observed Rome not as an empire but as a memory, its military organization, its diplomacy, its systems of command. The Lombards began to change. From clans to kings. Out of constant warfare and negotiation emerged stronger leadership. Charismatic war leaders, Duchies, began to dominate multiple clans. Over time, these leaders forged something new, a monarchy. Not a Roman state, but no longer a loose tribal federation either. The Lombards were becoming a people capable of coordinated conquest. Alboin enters. Among these leaders, one name would define their destiny. Alban, a king forged in the brutal politics of Central Europe. Alban unified the Lombards at precisely the moment Italy became vulnerable. He inherited a people hardened by migration, trained by frontier warfare, and ready to gamble everything on one final move south. Pause before the storm. By the mid-6th century, the Lombards stood at a crossroads. They were no longer wanderers. They were not yet rulers of Italy, but they were prepared culturally, militarily, and politically for the leap that would redefine them. The next movement would not be gradual. It would be decisive. The Lombard conquest of Italy did not begin with a declaration of war. It began with timing. By the mid-6th century, the Lombards were no longer outsiders looking in. From their base in Pannonia, they had fought with the Byzantines against the Ostrogoths, and against them when interests diverged. They knew the terrain, they knew Roman weaknesses, and they knew something else. Italy was exhausted. Decades of war, plague, and overtaxation had hollowed out the peninsula. Byzantine rule existed on maps and in titles, but not in manpower. The so-called reconquest of Italy by Emperor Justinian had been a victory in name only. Cities were depopulated, fortifications crumbled, garrisons were thin, underpaid, and isolated. Italy was unified on parchment. In reality, it was undefended space. This was the opening Alban had been waiting for. In the spring of 568 CE, Alban made his move. What crossed into Italy was not an army in the Roman sense. It was a people in motion. Lombards marched alongside Saxons, remnants of the Gepids, Bulgars, and other allied groups. Warriors led the way, but behind them came families, servants, livestock, and entire households. This was not a raid. It was a relocation of power. The Julian Alps were the gateway. Unlike Hannibal's desperate gamble centuries earlier, the Lombards crossed with preparation and intent. There was no Roman force strong enough to stop them, no defensive line, no coordinated response. Once the Alps were crossed, northern Italy lay open. Resistance was sporadic and ineffective. Byzantine commanders lacked reinforcements and clear orders. Local elites often fled or surrendered rather than endure siege. One by one, Lombard control spread across the Po Valley. Verona, Milan, Brescia, these were not symbolic conquests. These were the administrative and economic hearts of northern Italy. Only one city held out, Pavia. For 3 years, the Lombards laid siege to the city, patiently, methodically. This was not the behavior of nomadic raiders. It was the conduct of rulers in waiting. When Pavia finally fell, it became more than a conquest. It became a capital. From this moment forward, Lombard rule in Italy was no longer temporary. With Pavia secured, Alban took the title Rex Langobardorum, king of the Lombards. But this was not a Roman-style monarchy. It was a warrior kingship, held together by loyalty, fear, and success. And it was dangerously personal. Alban did not reign long. Later in 572 CE, he was assassinated, likely with the involvement of his wife Rosamund, a Gepid princess whose father Alban had slain. According to later sources, Alban had forced her to drink from a cup made from her father's skull. Whether legend or truth, the symbolism is revealing. Lombard power had arrived in Italy, but it was still brutal, unstable, and deeply personal. Alban's death did not stop the Lombards. If anything, it accelerated fragmentation. Without a strong central ruler, Lombard dukes pushed outward on their own initiative, seizing territory, carving out power bases, and ruling independently. Italy was no longer Roman, but it was not unified either. By the late 6th century, the Lombards controlled most of northern and central Italy. But the way they conquered would shape the way they ruled, not as a single state, but as a kingdom of competing duchies. And that instability would define the next century. The kingdom without a king. The assassination of King Alban did more than remove a ruler. It removed the only force holding the Lombard kingdom together. With no direct heir and no agreed system of succession, Lombard Italy fractured almost overnight. What followed was not chaos, but something more dangerous, independent power. This period would later be remembered as the rule of the dukes. After Alban's death, the Lombards did not immediately crown a new king. Instead, authority splintered. Roughly 30 dukes, military commanders who had seized cities during the conquest, now ruled their own territories outright. Each duke commanded his own army, controlled local taxation, and governed according to his own interests. There was no capital, no central court, no unified policy, only Lombard power divided. Some duchies quickly emerged as dominant. In central Italy, the Duchy of Spoleto under Harold I became a powerful buffer between the Lombards and the remnants of Byzantine authority. Further south, the Duchy of Benevento, ruled by Zotto, evolved into an almost independent Lombard state, so distant from northern Italy that it would often act entirely on its own. In the north, duchies like Friuli, Trento, Brescia, and Bergamo controlled key Alpine passes and economic centers, each functioning as a self-contained military state. Italy was no longer ruled. It was occupied by competing strongmen. This fragmentation was not without advantages. Local rule allowed dukes to react quickly to threats, negotiate with nearby Roman populations, and enforce authority without waiting for royal approval. Lombard governance became flexible, brutal, and efficient on a local level. But the cost was unity. Dukes competed rather than cooperated. Alliances shifted constantly. Personal rivalries outweighed collective survival. The Lombards had conquered Italy together, but they ruled it alone. necessity forced compromise. In 584 CE, faced with sustained external pressure, the dukes agreed to restore the monarchy. They elected Othari, son of the former King Clef, as their new ruler, but this was not a return to Alban's authority. The dukes surrendered only half their lands to support the crown. Power remained decentralized. Loyalty remained conditional. The Lombard kingdom was reborn, not as a unified state, but as a federation of armed duchies. From this point forward, Lombard Italy would exist in permanent tension. Kings with limited authority. Dukes with near-sovereign power. A kingdom strong enough to survive, but too divided to dominate. This political fragmentation would define Lombard rule for generations, and it would shape how they lived, governed, believed, and ultimately how they fell. A society built for war. Early Lombard society was tribal, patriarchal, and martial. At the top stood the king, first among warriors, followed by dukes and nobles whose authority came from land, followers, and reputation. Beneath them were the Alemanni, free men who owed military service and formed the backbone of Lombard armies. This was not a professional force paid in coin, but a warrior class bound by obligation, honor, and reward. Below the Alemanni were freedmen and slaves, many tied to estates taken over from Roman landowners. Lombard power rested on control of land and people, not cities alone. Wealth was measured simply: land, livestock, weapons, and renown. Justice among the early Lombards was personal. Before written law, disputes were settled through custom, oath, and often blood feud. Injury demanded retaliation. Death demanded compensation or vengeance. Honor was collective. An insult to one man was an insult to his kin. This system kept order in small communities, but was dangerously unstable in a kingdom now ruling Roman cities and diverse populations. Italy demanded something more durable. Law enters the kingdom. That change came under Rothari. In 643 CE, Rothari issued the Edictum Rothari, the first written Lombard law code. It did not replace Lombard custom, it preserved it, but it framed those customs within a written Roman-style legal structure. Germanic principles like wergild, monetary compensation for injury or death, were codified alongside procedural rules inherited from Roman law. Violence was no longer just remembered, it was recorded. This moment marked a turning point. The Lombards were no longer just conquerors, they were governors. Gods, then God. Originally, the Lombards followed a Germanic pagan religion, worshipping warlike and fate-driven deities familiar across northern Europe. These beliefs traveled with them through centuries of migration. Italy changed that. Contact with Roman populations, bishops, and clergy gradually pulled the Lombards toward Christianity, first Arian Christianity and later Catholicism. The transition accelerated under Theodelinda, whose influence at the end of the 6th century guided the Lombard elite toward the Catholic Church. By the 7th century, most Lombards were no longer religious outsiders in Italy. Conversion softened rule. It also bound Lombard kings to Rome, spiritually, if not politically. The Lombard language, a Germanic tongue, left behind almost no written literature. What survives comes from law codes, names, and fragments preserved by others. But in the ground, the Lombards speak clearly. Graves across Italy reveal swords, shields, ornate fibulae, belts, and jewelry, markers of identity carried even into death. These objects show a people proud of their warrior past, even as they adopted Roman habits of settlement and architecture. Living like Romans, ruling like Lombards. Lombard settlements reused Roman cities, roads, and villas. Over time, their architecture blended Germanic simplicity with Roman stonework and Christian symbolism. One of the clearest surviving examples is the Tempietto Longobardo, a small but richly decorated church that captures the fusion of cultures at the heart of Lombard Italy. The Lombards did not erase Rome. They inhabited its ruins and reshaped them. By the 8th century, the Lombards were no longer strangers in Italy. They spoke Latin, they followed Roman law, They worshipped in Christian churches, yet politically they remained divided. Militarily, they ruled through force. Culturally, they stood between worlds, neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian. That in-between identity would be their strength for centuries, and their weakness when a new power arrived from the north. The end of the Lombards, Charlemagne, and the fall of the kingdom. By the late 8th century, the balance of power in Western Europe had shifted. To the north of the Alps, the Franks, under Charlemagne, had become the most formidable military and political force of the age. What Rome had once been, the Frankish kingdom now aspired to become. For the Lombards, this rising power would prove fatal. Rising tension in Italy. The collapse of Lombard rule did not begin with Frankish ambition alone. It began with fear. Over decades, Lombard kings pushed steadily southward, pressing into central Italy. These advances alarmed the papacy, whose authority rested on fragile territorial control and delicate diplomacy. At the center of this tension stood Desiderius, the last Lombard king, ambitious, determined, and increasingly seen as a threat to Rome itself. The Pope turns north. The papacy had no army capable of stopping the Lombards, so it did what it had done before. Pope Hadrian I appealed to the Franks. This was not merely a plea for protection, it was an invitation to reshape Italy. For Charlemagne, the request aligned perfectly with his ambitions. He had personal reasons as well. A failed marriage alliance with Desiderius's daughter had left relations poisoned. Politically, Lombard expansion threatened Frankish influence south of the Alps. In 773 CE, Charlemagne answered the call. The Alpine crossing. Like so many before him, Charlemagne crossed the Alps into Italy. But unlike the Lombards 2 centuries earlier, this was not a migration. It was a punitive campaign. Frankish forces advanced methodically, bypassing resistance, cutting off Lombard strongholds, and driving directly toward the heart of the kingdom. The Siege of Pavia. Pavia, the same city that had once crowned Alban's triumph, now became the Lombards' last stand. After months of siege, the city fell in the spring of 774. There was no heroic last charge, no dramatic collapse, only exhaustion and inevitability. Desiderius was captured and exiled to a monastery, likely at Corbie in northern Francia. His kingdom ended not in fire but in removal. Charlemagne entered Pavia in triumph. Then, in a moment of profound symbolism, he did something unprecedented. He took the Lombard crown. Rex Langobardorum. Charlemagne declared himself Rex Langobardorum, king of the Lombards. This was a turning point in European history. For the first time, a foreign ruler absorbed a barbarian kingdom without annihilating its institutions. Lombard laws, elites, and structures were preserved, but subordinated to Frankish authority. The Lombard kingdom was extinguished. The Lombard people were not. Survival at the margins. Even after 774, Lombard identity did not vanish overnight. The Duchies of Spoleto and Benevento survived for generations, preserving Lombard customs, language, and autonomy well into the 10th century. In the north, however, Frankish administration transformed Italy, introducing new systems of landholding, governance, and military obligation. Lombardy became Frankish. Italy became Carolingian. With the fall of the Lombards, the political map of Europe changed permanently. Italy passed from post-Roman fragmentation into the orbit of a new empire, one that would soon crown Charlemagne as emperor of the Romans. The Lombards had ruled Italy for over 2 centuries. They had conquered it by force. They had governed it through compromise. And in the end, they were undone by the very world they helped create. Final reflection. The Lombards were not a footnote. They were the bridge between Rome and medieval Europe, between migration and monarchy, between barbarian warbands and Christian kingship. Their story did not end at Pavia. It continued under a new crown. In the next story, the map widens again from barbarian kingdoms to empire. Coming next, Charlemagne, the making of a Western empire.